Okay, so let's continue with part two of qualitative research methods. So let's talk about what qualitative research methods really are. So to begin with, qualitative research methods are about seeing through the eyes of the people being studied. This means that while in the natural sciences we're looking at the effects of two things with each other in the world around them, we're still looking at it from an outsider's perspective. In qualitative research, we are looking at it from an insider's perspective. And that's because the objects of social science, which are people, are capable of giving meaning to their environments and their actions. A molecule of a element cannot give itself meaning. A person has to ascribe meaning to it. But when it comes to an interaction between two people, they can define meaning. So if a person shakes another person's hand, the two people involved in society as a whole have agreed on what a handshake means. So qualitative then allows us to have a methodology that then reflects on the differences between people and object. So it expresses how viewing the world through the eyes of people is valued. And it seeks to probe beneath the appearances. So in quantitative research, while we're looking at predicting factors of a particular outcome, the qualitative role seeks to understand why those factors matter at all. The qualitative research process focuses on context. So they usually require a great deal of descriptions and details for the research. And details are pretty important because the details matter, right? We've all heard the saying, details matter, devil's in the details, things like that. And what those sayings describe is how important details are. And details are significant to subjects. So just think of something as simple as the American flag. Now, for many Americans, seeing that would evoke feelings of patriotism and feelings of love for the country, but that may not be how everyone views that flag. And it's all about the historical context of what that flag has meant to those different groups. So the details then allow us to determine the significance and to provide an account of the context for why people believe or behave the way that they do. In other words, it gives us a contextual understanding of social behavior because we cannot understand behavior outside of the specific context in which they operate. It also shifts the emphasis away from the actual processes of collecting data. So quantitative research tends to view social life in terms of processes. So it shows that events and patterns unfold over time due to certain factors. So with qualitative, evidence is often used to show how things are in flux and how things change over time based on the individuals acting in those times and the feelings and beliefs that they have prescribed to whatever we're studying. Qualitative is also very flexible, even if it is limited. So you can take an unstructured approach where you keep the structure to a minimum. So for instance, in interviews, you can create a interview guide that just says broadly, I'm going to talk about your opinions of the American flag. And there's no specific questions written, and you create questions on the fly about that topic based on the responses that the person gives back to you. Okay. It's also, because it's unstructured, it can be more flexible because I'm not asking a person the same questions, right? So each person I interview, the questions may change based on their responses. So think about like in journalism, where a journalist is interviewing someone on television, they may have like an idea of questions that they want to ask, but depending on what the interviewee says, they may change up their questions because they just found something more interesting. Qualitative interviews do the same thing. We also tend to ground our theory in the data. And so this comes up with something that we call grounded theory. And this theory stresses the importance of allowing theoretical ideas to emerge from one's data. So we are showing what we find. So Researchers review the data, and then as they're reviewing it, themes become apparent. And these themes, they say, emerge. And so then we tag those themes with codes so that we can analyze them. Now, as more data are collected, as we re-review it, we may change our codes, we may group codes together, we may eliminate codes as like we find that something doesn't carry forward. So maybe we're studying the flag and we're looking for themes of patriotism, but no one actually mentions patriotism, or maybe only one respondent out of 50 mentions patriotism. Then that's probably not a good theme, and we would need to either eliminate it or combine it into something else or reconceptualize it. So all of this is to say that we create new categories as the research develops and goes along. And this is what makes it really different from the traditional scientific model of research. So instead of starting with hypotheses and moving forward to the theory, we're really starting with the data collected, developing theories, and working towards a hypothesis. So let's talk about when it's appropriate to use qualitative research. So first, if we're really just interested in a person's personal experience with a phenomena, then it might be more important to look at the qualitative factors than the quantitative factors. So for instance, maybe we're interested in why people take part in a social movement. And instead of trying to look at factors that would predict someone joining a social movement, maybe we want to ask them directly to find out what their individual reasons are for joining. In that case, we'd use qualitative research. It's also often used for exploratory research to find out why people might want to be involved in a thing, so that we can then study and look for predicting factors of the thing. Another reason that qualitative is useful is that it often allows us to study very complex and very sensitive issues. So we could look at feelings towards different groups in America. So looking at immigration or members of the LGBTQ communities, and we can actually explore these complex subjects in ways that are sensitive and open to the experience of the people participating. We can also use it for program evaluation, and that's what we're primarily going to use it for in this class. We can use it for action research to provide an impetus for making a change in society, and most often we use it in combination with quantitative research to make explanations for the findings we find in quantitative analysis. So when we're pointing out a cause and effect, then we can use qualitative to explain why that cause and effect may have happened. Now, there are several diverse methods that are associated with qualitative research. We're going to go through a couple of these, but some of them are ethnographies, qualitative interviewing, focus groups, discourse analysis, or content analysis. Now, there are some critiques of qualitative research. Let's talk about those for a second. The first and most common critique is that qualitative research is too subjective. So the reason that that is said is that it relies too much on the views of the researcher about what is significant and important. Rather than relying on predefined definitions before data is collected, the researcher defines what is important based on what they find in the data. And that means that there's a lot of the researcher's opinions embedded in those ideas. It also requires close personal relationships to be developed sometimes between the researcher and the people being studied. Now, this creates some practical problems. The biggest two are that you can go native and lose sight of what you're studying. What this means is that you become too close and personal with the group that you're studying, and you kind of lose sight of why it's important to study them, or you view them more favorably or in a less objective light. And then you may also ignore then where the limits are. So there have been numerous studies that have been done in the past where scientists are studying groups that participate in illegal activities like biker gangs and other forms of groups like that, where they participate sometimes in the crimes or dangerous activities such as drug use with the people they're studying because they want to be accepted and trusted by the group. And then they kind of forget, hey, no, I'm a scientist, I should not be taking part in this, but they do it anyway. And then there's the possibility that that researcher will only be able to see through the eyes of some of the participants that they most identify with. So maybe there are a couple of people in the sample that they share commonalities with, and the more they hear their story, the more they're like, no, this person is who's important. It's also extremely difficult to replicate. So, because of the unstructured nature and the reliance on the researchers' just opinions, it's really hard to replicate qualitative research. And so this brings problems of its own because the science should be able to be tested by anyone over time in different groups the exact same way in order to determine if a finding is real. And so qualitative creates the problem in that you usually can't replicate it because a lot of the time it's the dynamic between the researcher and the study participants, as well as the time of the year or other factors that usually can't be controlled for in an experimental study. This also can arise with problems when different groups don't agree on what is important. So different research groups. So you have one researcher who does this study and finds these things. You have another researcher that does this study. They might find the exact same things, but they also find these other things and they think that's more important, right? So now we have two studies and they've gone in different directions for what is important out of that study. So replication is nearly impossible. It's also really hard to generalize findings. Okay, so what this means is that the smaller the groups and the more nuanced the group response, the less likely you can generalize those responses to the broader audience. So think back to when I asked you earlier to define love, right? I can create a definition for love and give that to 10,000 people, and I can see how many people agree with me. But if I interviewed each of you and asked you what is your definition of love, most of you are going to come up with different definitions. There are going to be very little overlaps. And so then I have to decide if you are saying the same thing as someone else. And that is a subjective opinion. And because I am making those decisions, I can't generalize to a larger population. Okay, so basically then I can only say at most that it is the feelings of all the people in the group, that I can generalize to the group that I studied. There's also a large lack of transparency because of how these projects play out. It's often really hard to give a detailed description on how data is collected. So before I became a medical sociologist and began teaching public health courses, when I was in grad school, I was studying politics. And part of our studies that we published were going to rallies of politicians and asking people questions as if we were also considering voting for this person to find out why they voted for them. And we would have to change up our approach every single rally to be identifiable to the group as someone that they would want to talk to, so that we could get them to open up to us and trust us. That is really hard to write out and make it clear exactly how we did that, and that leads to a lack of transparency. So now let's look at some of the brief qualitative approaches. I'm not going to go into all of them, but here are a few. So some of them include ethnographies, phenologies, field research, historical research, narrative research, and grounded theory. We're going to talk about 3 of these. So let's start with ethnography. So this was an approach that largely comes from the fields of anthropology and sociology, but public health does use this. And the focus of ethnography is studying an entire culture. Now, ethnography is extremely broad, and it has a large variety of people who practice it and a wide variety of methods used in it. But the most common ethnographic approach is participant observation. So this is part of field research where we would go and we would watch groups. So think about a classic participant observation experiment where we're looking at how often people exercise. So we randomly show up at, say, a school and we watch the amount of exercise that kids get, and we compare that to other schools. That would be a participant observation. Now, when we think about like how that could affect the amount of exercise that they get, do you think that the days the scientists showed up that the school may have the kids exercise a little bit more so that it looks better? And this is how we talk about like that lack of transparency, or how the researcher becomes a part of the experiment. But this is probably the most common form of ethnography. the ethnographer in this instance becomes immersed in the culture as either an observer or an active participant, and we record everything that happens on notes. Now, just like grounded theory that we're going to talk about in a second, there's no preset limiting of what will be observed, and there's no real ending point in an ethnographic study. Once we reach a point of what we call saturation, that's when we stop. Now, field research can be considered either a broad approach to qualitative research or a method of gathering qualitative data. If it's used as a method, that's when it's an ethnography. The essential idea is that the researcher goes into the field to observe the phenomena in its natural state. And it then is very linked to either participant observation or just active participant observation. So the person goes, as I did with the rallies, and we become one of the group, and then we take extensive notes that we then code and analyze. So thinking about some of my work, we went to the rallies. I would say that I'm a libertarian who is going to be voting for a particular candidate, but I wanted to see like what they felt about this other candidate, so I came to their rally and I wanted to know why they were voting for them. And so they would then tell me in their own words and experiences why they thought I should vote for their candidate. And then as soon as I finished talking to a person, I would slip off somewhere and I would make very detailed notes about the things that they had said so that we could analyze those things later. The last one that we're going to talk about is grounded theory, and I've kind of talked about it already, but I want to make clear, first of all, that grounded theory is a complex iterative process. That means it's tested and retested and refined until we get it down to just the bare minimum of what something means. So we usually start with questions that help guide research, but they're not intended to be static or confining. So in other words, I'm not asking, do you believe in this, yes or no? I'm asking, what are your thoughts on this? And we build from there. Now, as we begin gathering data, we begin noticing some themes, and these core theoretical concepts are then identified, and we make linkages between these theoretical concepts and the data. Now, this early phase can be very open, and it can take months. Later on, once we have kind of completed what is the theoretical implications, we can then engage in verification and summary. Now, this tends to evolve towards one core category that is central. And there are several key analytic strategies. So we might code, and this is the process of categorizing qualitative data and describing the implications of the data into categories. We could memo, which is a process of recording thoughts and ideas of the researcher as they evolve through the study. And then we can create diagrams and sessions where we pull all the details together to make sense of the data. So now let's explore some of the methods that we use. I've talked briefly about participant observation, so let's talk a little bit about it. This is the most common method for qualitative data collection, and it's also one of the most demanding because it requires the researcher to become a participant in the culture or context being observed. Now, participant observation discusses how to enter the context, the role the researcher played as a participant, how data was collected and stored, and then how it's analyzed. It often requires months or years, and it requires intense work because the researcher has to be accepted as a part of the culture. So thinking about what we did with the rallies, we had to convince the people at the rallies that we belonged there and that we should be there so that they would talk to us and open up to us about why they believed what they believed and why they were voting the way they were voting. There's also direct observation. Now, this is different from participant observation in a couple of ways because the direct observer doesn't typically try to become a participant. So go back to what I had just said earlier about the scientists watching how much exercise is done by children at school. The scientists are not exercising with the children, they're just there watching. It then says that this is a more detached perspective, that the researcher is just watching rather than taking part. And we can use technology in this case. It's really hard to use recording devices in participant observation because people would see those and know that you're recording them, and then they're like, hey, I don't want to talk to you because this is shady. But in direct observation, you can use recording devices because people know you're just there to watch them. The direct observation tends to be more focused than participant observation because we're typically looking for specific events or situations rather than trying to understand all of it in the entire context. We also see that direct observation doesn't take as long because I can just show up at a school and watch kids exercise. That's relatively quick. I just have to get permission from the school to show up and then show up on a day, watch it, and I'm done. With participant observation, I have to get invited into a culture. I have to have people want me there so that they know that I'm not there to make fun of them or to mock them, that I'm really there for their experience. There's also interviewing. Now, interviewing has 3 basic types, so let's talk about each of them. They're structured interviews. This is the type of interview where we ask every single person the same questions. The questions are all planned and created in advance, and the respondents are asked the same questions in the same order. Now, the advantages of this is that everyone is asked the exact same question, the exact same way, in the exact same order. But the problem is that you can't deviate if a respondent says something interesting. So if a person says that they refuse to get the COVID vaccine because they believe there are microchips in the vaccine, if you don't have a question that asks them specifically why they don't want to get the COVID vaccine, you will never get that response, right? So that leads us to unstructured interviews. Now, in most cases, and what you're going to be doing in this class, we use unstructured interviews to get information. Now, this is where we ask questions that we do not prepare in advance. We have some ideas about things we want to talk about, some broad topics that we want to bring up, but we haven't specifically written out questions, and we generate the questions in real time with the respondents. This means that it becomes more conversational. It's like you and a friend having a conversation about a topic. Now, the advantages to this is that it allows kind of a free-flowing conversation, and it seems more casual, and it helps people relax and feel more comfortable during the interview. The disadvantage, though, is that you're going to get different responses because people are asked different questions. You may not ask everybody the same question every time. There may be topics that you ask everyone, but each respondent is going to respond differently, and that's going to lead you down a different path. So thinking about what I said on the last slide, you might ask, why did you not get the vaccine? And one person might say that they didn't get the vaccine because they thought there were microchips. But when you talk to another person, they may not have a reason at all for not getting the vaccine, that they just saw it on television or heard their politicians or their friends, and it doesn't go down those routes. So whereas with the first person, you might want to ask more questions about the microchips and things in the vaccine, with the second person not believing that, you're not going to ask those questions, so it's going to be a completely different interview experience. There are also semi-structured interviews. Now, again, this is very similar to the unstructured, but it takes a blend of both approaches. You might have a few predetermined questions. There are some questions that you're absolutely going to ask, but the rest of it you have a guide. So in this, some questions are predetermined and we ask all respondents, while others are spontaneous as part of a conversation. So it combines kind of the best of both worlds, and it offers the advantages of both. This means that we can kind of compare a little bit because we do have some questions that are asked in common. Now, disadvantages to this are that semi-structured interviews are less objective than structured interviews because, again, structured interviews, same questions, same order, same way. There are also things called case studies. You should be familiar with these in public health. This is an extensive study of a specific person or context. So, for instance, Freud developed cases of several individuals as a basis for the theory of psychoanalysis, and Piaget did the same with children to study developmental phases. And then there's Milgram that we talked about in last week's lectures on ethics, where he watched a person deliver electric shocks. Now, there's no single way to conduct a case study, and it uses a combination of methods from unstructured interviewing to direct observation, as was the case in Milgram. Lastly, the one that we're going to talk about is content analysis, and you're going to be doing this in this class as well. Now, content analysis is a research technique used to make replicable and valid inferences about interpreting a source, whether that is a picture, a text, a situation. And so what we do is we take some type of text, whether it's a document or what have you, and we convert it into qualitative data. Now, we can ask people, for instance, to organize pictures based on feelings, or to tell us how a poem makes them feel. And so we translate this into quantitative data, and we use chi-square analysis to kind of understand that. So, for example, we could use something called Fisher's exact, which is where we take chi-square analysis of small samples. So one of my papers looked at the Gamergate movement that happened in the early 2010s. And so Gamergate was a movement that arose for gamers. It was specifically making the arguments that there was no transparency in gaming journalism. It was actually more related to things like misogyny and racism, but we weren't studying that. Instead, we were studying how people organized and why the Gamergate movement failed, because there's arguments that if you use social media, and Gamergate took place completely on Reddit, that you would be successful, that social media leads to success for a social movement. And so these groups organized on Reddit, and as we all know, Reddit is an anonymous source. You don't know who you're talking to. And so what we found is that using Reddit instead of, say, Twitter or Facebook, the groups devolved into fighting amongst themselves. So we used Fisher's exact to get the statistical significance between cohesion and conflict over time. Okay, so this is going to end our lecture this week. If you have any questions, please reach out to your TA, and I will see you next week.